All right, hello everyone. I'm really excited to start off our talk series today. My name is Jack Treado, and my talk today is going to be about something that you may not have heard of specifically, but it's influenced a lot of the science that you might have seen around you. And so the title of my talk is Emergence, which is what I like to think of as the power of simplicity. And emergence isn't really a specific idea in one particular discipline of science. It's really a unifying principle that scientists like to use in order to understand the behavior of complex systems. But before I actually define this term, I'd like to start off with an example, which comes from a really excellent bird called the starling. And so this is a European starling. It's indigenous to many parts of the continental Europe. And when you just look at the bird on its own, it's maybe very beautifully plumed, but it's not so different from any of the other songbirds that you might see in your backyard. And it is, by maybe physiological standards, a very standard species. But what is interesting about the European starling is what happens when you get many, many of them together. And they do something called a murmuration. And a murmuration is just a very large flock of starling. These tend to happen later in the evening when starling come back from the field to where they are roosting for the night. And right before basically they go back to their nests, they come together in these massive flocks of almost 10,000 individuals strong, and they just fly around in these beautiful aerial patterns. The flocks have really fascinating physical properties. For example, the flock can come together and move apart. You can actually see parts of the flock that are becoming darker. These are areas where birds are coming together and moving away from each other. And as you can see when they fly over you, they're just flying as normal birds do, but somehow when they come together, they make something really incredible and outside of the normal flight patterns of if they were just standard birds on their own. And not to fool anybody here, this has actually been in the news, since this is a Science in the News talk. There's been a lot of literature and articles actually written about starling murmurations, and I think that all of these are testament to the interest that these flocking patterns sort of induce in the public's imagination. All these articles are basically written in response to how beautiful and how strange these flocking patterns really are. And I think this example is a really nice test case for how scientists go about understanding complex behavior. Because we have an individual that, again, maybe it looks very nice, but it's not special in any way relative to other nice-looking songbirds. But somehow when you put many of them together, you get these incredibly strange and beautiful flocking patterns. And so essentially we're asking, what are the rules that allow us to go from this level, the individual, to this level, the complex collective? And there have been many historical perspectives on trying to understand this phenomenon of simple individual things coming together to make something complex. The first historical perspective that I'd like to talk about is something called reductionism. And reductionism sort of goes as it sounds. So suppose we have a bird that I think we all know of, and suppose that we're ecologists sitting in a field watching this bird move about. We might see the bird as an individual, and then later at night we see it join a collective, and suppose we see this beautiful collective exhibiting some strange flocking patterns that we hope to understand. If we wanted to understand this behavior through the lens of reductionism, we might single out an individual in the collective. We might say, well, what does the individual bird do that makes it so special? But like I've said before, the individual bird actually doesn't give us any hint to the complex behaviors that we see in the flock. If we were to single out an individual, we wouldn't see it flock, almost by definition. We would just see it find the nearest source of food and go there. And so this isn't really a flocking behavior, this is individual behavior, which is completely distinct from the collective. The opposite approach that we might take if we want to try and understand this behavior is a perspective called vitalism. Vitalism was very popular in the late 18th century when chemistry and biology were in their infancies as disciplines. And a vitalist might say, well, we have some insanely beautiful and complex flocking behavior, and the individual perspective doesn't really get us anywhere, so this behavior must somehow be outside of science. Because it's a living system, it must not be describable by the physical laws that we know. And so in a vitalist's perspective, there might be some megabird sitting in the trees somewhere that's invisible that uses telekinetic brain waves to control the flock from afar. And so this is what vitalism really is. It's saying that, well, there must be some rules that are outside of physical science that are governing these complex living phenomena. Luckily, this way of thinking died out around the 19th century once chemistry and biology became more sophisticated sciences. But that still leaves us at a tricky point because we can't take the perspective of reductionism, but we also don't want to take the perspective of vitalism. So the perspective that scientists use in order to understand complex phenomena is something called emergence. And an emergent perspective is if we want to understand a complex system like this flock, what we'll do is we'll single out a subset of the individuals. And we'll ask, how does this subset interact with itself? What are the mechanisms in which birds can talk and communicate to each other, maybe not with vocal cords, but with, maybe they can follow each other around in the flock, maybe they can communicate just by their position in space. And we can ask, what are the modes and mechanisms of these interactions that lead to the complex collective behavior that we observe? And so this is what emergence is. It's when a system displays behavior that is greater than the sum of that system's components. And what emergence really asks is how do things interact with each other in order to create this greater than the sum of its parts phenomenon. And you might ask, well, how does this definition help scientists? Well, it tells us what not to do, essentially. Because if we think of something as emergent, we know that it cannot be completely reduced. We can't focus on the individual. But we also should not try to make up something that is that essentially is outside of science. We shouldn't argue that complex phenomena are unexplainable. We should not take the route of the megabird in trying to understand the flocking behavior. Looking for emergence actually helps us single out simple rules that govern the interactions, or the simple rules that govern the collective phenomena. And since these rules are often simpler than the collective behavior that we're trying to understand, it makes it a lot easier for us as scientists. So this is what emergence is, but I still think that it's a little unhelpful to just have the definition. So there are a few other examples that you may have heard of or been a part of, actually, that you might not have thought of as emergent behavior. And I think all of our least favorite example of emergent phenomena is actually a traffic jam. And so this might have happened to you. At some point you might be driving down the road, and you just sometimes will hit traffic jams that don't seem to be caused by a traffic cop or a bottleneck or an accident. You just sort of seem to slow down. And so this form of traffic actually is completely emergent and just comes naturally out of the amount of, basically, of the number of cars on the road at a given time. And so this phenomenon was actually studied in several experiments that were performed in Tokyo at a university in Tokyo where there's a lot of traffic every single day. And what the researchers did was that they took about 20 cars and put them on a circular track. And they instructed the drivers of the vehicles to drive at around 20 miles an hour, keep a constant speed, and to also keep pace with their neighbors. And so what they did was, as the cars start to move around, the cars at first seem to be able to do this. They can keep up with their neighbors. But as you can see, some drivers start to slip up. They're not able to keep pace with their neighbors. Some rush ahead, some lag behind. And just because of the fact that all of these drivers can't keep a constant speed, and actually if you look over to the right, you eventually get a traffic jam emerging on this very simple track. There are no lane changes here. There's no speed limit. There's very simple rules, and even out of these very simple rules in this very controlled experiment, we still have the emergence of traffic that sort of naturally comes out of just the fact that cars can't keep pace with their neighbors. Another example of an emergent behavior that you might not have thought about before, but I think is really interesting, is what happens when you put many metronomes on a table that's allowed to move. And so what is being done in this video is researchers have put 32 metronomes on a table that is supported by columns that are essentially attached to hinges that allows the table to vibrate freely. And as they start all the metronomes, you can see that the metronomes they all have the same frequency, so they beat at the same speed, but they beat at different points, and they are out of sync or in a state of asynchrony. And if you can focus a little bit here, you might be able to see that the table is vibrating very slightly, and that the metronomes themselves are actually vibrating the table in various very small ways. And actually, what happens if you fast forward into the video a little bit, what you find is that the metronomes spontaneously come into a state of synchrony. They somehow have this emergent tendency to sort of synchronize with their neighbors. And that's just because they can move the table on their own. And so there are many different examples of emergence that we could identify, but we keep on looking for, or whenever we're trying to understand why things are emergent, we have to look for the simple rules that govern this emergent behavior. With the metronomes, it was that they could shake the table. With cars in a traffic jam, it's because cars are bad at keeping track with their neighbors. And so, in order to understand more general complex systems, scientists often turn to computer simulations in order to understand how precisely simple rules cause complex behaviors. Because in a computer, you can have very precise control over the simple rules, and you can see what happens in a complex system. And so the simple rule system that I'm going to talk about here is a computational simulation that is a class of simulations called cellular automata. Cellular automata are called this because you might be able to see this on the screen. There is a lattice of grid points, or cells, and inside of those cells we can put something called an automaton, or basically an agent that can move or do some task given the rules that we impose on it. This specific simulation has a specific name. It's called Langston's ant. It's one of the first cellular automata simulations ever performed. And the rules at which this simulation obeys are as follows. So we have some ant that lives on a two-dimensional grid. If the ant finds itself in a white space, we will make it turn right, and we'll flip the cell to black. If the ant conversely finds itself on a black square, we'll have the ant turn left and flip the square back to white. And so what we can do is we can actually run this simulation in time and see what happens. So at first, the ant finds itself on a white square and turns right and changes the square to black. It continues to do this whenever it's on a white square. Eventually it finds a black square, and so it's going to have to turn left, and it'll flip that square back to white. And so now it's back on a white square, so it'll turn right, and we can iterate through this process many, many times, and what we're going to want to see is what happens to the board. How does the ant's interactions with the cells on the computer, how does that change? So initially, the ant sort of forms this maybe semi-symmetric shape on the lattice of points, but it makes short work of it and destroys any semblance of order very quickly, and things pretty rapidly devolve into very sporadic chaos. And so I'm actually going to have to, this is a movie that I made of the simulation, I'm going to actually have to zoom the simulation out so we can see how far the ant is actually going. And as you can see, there's not really a lot of order to what the ant is doing up until this point. But watch what happens. I froze this simulation at a very special point. The ants are out here. And so far, the ant has been moving sporadically. But at this point in the simulation, it happens to start moving in a very periodic way. There is an emergence of order that sort of just comes out of the natural rules that we place on this system. And it's not like I've changed anything in the simulation. I haven't altered any of these rules. If we zoom in on sort of the wavefront of this ordered domain, and here's the ant, and he still moves in the same exact way that he was before, and this will happen as long as we want to run the simulation. So this periodic behavior has emerged very naturally from the very simple rules that we imposed. So what caused the ant to behave as it did? How did this periodic behavior emerge naturally out of complete disorder? Well, the ant could interact with the squares. Interactions generated the complex behavior. The ant could change the color of the board, but also the ant would change its movement based on what color the board was. And so this feedback loop actually spontaneously generates a periodic pattern, and the nice thing about this being a computer simulation, we know exactly what rules went in, so we can exactly figure out how these rules generated something complex. So this is a very powerful technique in which scientists use in many different ways to study complex collective behavior. And so there are many other examples that we can think of systems that display something emergent. One of my favorites are snowflakes. And so snowflakes is essentially what happens when you have a mote of dust that is in a very cold liquid, and the liquid starts to freeze around the mote of dust. And when the water molecules start freezing around the mote of dust, other water molecules tend to freeze on them, and you get this cascade effect, and they grow out from the center of they grow out from the mote of dust in these very beautiful patterns. And what's even more incredible about this phenomenon is that every snowflake is unique. So the rules are very simple, but the emergent behavior is very complex and interesting. Let's say you get a lot of these snowflakes together, put them on a hillside, and you get an avalanche. And so avalanches are actually incredibly interesting emergent phenomena, because you normally have a very quiet, alpine hillside with a lot of lovely snow on it, but if you have a little bit too much, you get a cascade effect where all that snow comes down. And so avalanches are a very interesting class or a very general class of emergent phenomena. And biological systems are always have very incredible emergent phenomena. So this is a microscopic image of your brain. And these little fluorescent bright spots are actually neurons. And neurons are essentially just electrical signaling proteins that allow different signals in your brain to move from one place to another. And this was taken with a fluorescent imaging microscope. Although these neurons only really can send electrical signals back and forth to one another, if you get enough of them interacting in some spot, you can get consciousness and a personality and emotions and memory and all of these cognitive phenomena that are all due to just simple interactions between individual neuron cells. And in the animal kingdom itself, you have a lot of really interesting emergent phenomena. So this is basically a rubber sheet made of fire ants. And so fire ants have evolved to be very resistant to flooding. And what happens if a fire ant colony is submerged in water, or submerged in water, the fire ants will lock arms with one another, and they will grip each other strongly enough that the fire ants will start to respond to mechanical perturbation just like a rubber sheet. So what is done in this experiment is researchers are taking tweezers and they're pressing down on a fire ant colony, and it responds exactly like an elastic sheet. So there's this emergent material properties that fire ants use to survive flooding. And I think we have the brain, we have ants. All of life itself is actually emergent. The biological sciences have emergent phenomena everywhere you look. And so in this talk, I sort of more focused on the level of organisms. So we had worms, we had birds, and we had ants, and all of the interesting emergent phenomena that takes place with these organisms. But even at smaller lengths, at smaller sizes, you get emergent phenomena still. So proteins are essentially the molecular machines that do all the work in a cell. They come together to make cells. Cells come together to make tissues, and then eventually we get organisms. But then even organisms can come together to make collectives, and those collectives come together to make communities. And at every single point in this chain, emergence is there shuttling things and making things happen to go from one level to the next. And so up next, you'll hear a little bit from Lauren, where she'll talk about protein emergence in proteins and cells. And then in our last talk, you'll hear more from Melissa, where she will talk about emergence in collectives of organisms and the communities that they build. So thank you.